Hello, everyone. Can you hear me, David? Can you just clarify?
Yeah, I hear you fine.
Yeah, great. Hello, everyone. I'm Yaakov Ashkenazi, and I look after the Anglo-Israel Association's digital platforms outreach programs. And we at the AAA, we are delighted to welcome you to this webinar titled From Netanyahu's Trial to Possible Annexation, Where is Israel Heading? After a politically turbulent year in which included an unprecedented number of 3 elections, Prime Minister Netanyahu finally managed to form a government last month. Looking ahead into the summer, Israel's politics will be dominated by 2 questions primarily: the political future of the Prime Minister, who is currently facing trial for corruption charges, and the possible annexation of parts of the West Bank, the Jordan Valley in particular, following President Trump's deal of the century. Both questions expose the deep divisions within Israeli society and have long-term ramifications on both Israel's domestic and foreign policies. There's no better person to discuss these issues with us than David Horowitz. He's the founding editor of the Times of Israel. David will be speaking for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will have time for questions, which you can drop during the session into the Q&A chat room, and we will pick them up later. David, thank you so much for joining us today. And without further ado, I will pass on the screen to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jacob. Thank you, everybody who's on this call. I'm speaking to you from my office in Jerusalem. I tried to do this the other day, so forgive me if it doesn't work, but I'll do it again. So out my window there, you might just be able to see there's the YMCA. So it's a lovely blue sky. I don't know how that compares to wherever you guys are, but it's one of the great benefits of living in the city. The weather's great. So we're, like everybody else in the world, grappling with COVID-19 and doing relatively better than some places, and I'll talk about that a little bit. My office is semi-empty, as it has been for most of the last 2.5 months or so. We've had sort of people trickling back into the office within the limits of social distancing and so on. Journalists in Israel have been allowed to work the whole time. By work, I mean go out, do whatever they needed to do while maintaining social distancing. But of course, much of our work we've been able to do from home. We're dealing with this like everybody else is. We've had reporters who were, we had one who's in quarantine because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time with somebody who turned out to be carrying the virus. We've had a reporter, whose spouse is a frontline medical person. Everybody until quite recently with their little kids at home. And therefore doing our work, fortunate and feeling fortunate that we have our work. And I'll talk about that as well because of the economic consequences of what we're dealing with, and striving to keep people informed about current affairs at the same time as we're all battling this virus. So I'll talk in the next half hour or so about how Israel has dealt with COVID-19. I'll talk a little bit about the parallel political process that has played out here. As Yaakov said, we were 3 elections in the space of basically a year, almost a year and a half without a fully functioning government. We now have a government which is somewhat curious mix of people. I'll talk about that a bit. All of which also taking place in the context or against the background of our Prime Minister, the longest serving Prime Minister in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, also now being on trial in 3 criminal cases, one of which has a bribery charge attached to it, included in it. All of this playing out simultaneously in the usual regional circumstance. Remember, Israel is a very small country on the western edge of a largely hostile landmass. People lose track of that. I'm sure all of you know it, but 9 miles wide at its narrowest point, an unpredictable region, often a toxic region. And a country that not merely is surviving, but is certainly thriving in terms of tech and innovation and so on. Before I get going, I'll call your attention to a law that passed in Iran a couple of weeks ago and was endorsed, whatever the process is, by the president of Iran a few days ago, Hassan Rouhani, in which Iranians in all walks of life are banned from using any Israeli technology, any dealings with Israel, including any use of Israeli technology. The law actually specifies software or hardware. And this is also deemed to be a crime against God, doing anything that would constitute utilizing technology from the Zionist regime or any interaction with Israel. I just, if you have a couple of minutes, you might want to read an article I wrote with a lot of help from Saul Singer. Saul Singer is one of the co-authors of Startup Nation, the book on Israeli innovation. And basically, if Iran were to implement that law, it would essentially shut down. As Saul put it, it would go back 50 years or more. No computers, no internet, export issues, oil issues, medical procedure and treatment issues, just underlining how central Israeli innovation is to the functioning of modern societies and many societies that are not so modern. So I'm going to talk about a lot of pretty difficult, complicated issues. But I wanted to stress at the outside so much that is positive about Israel in terms of creativity and the capacity to serve as a light unto the nations. Maybe one of the finest things Israel ever did was learn to grow a great deal of produce with very little water via drip irrigation, and that's something that we taught Africa. And therefore, immense benefit from some pioneering Israeli technology. That remains the case. Okay. So let's start with COVID-19, and assuming most of you are in Britain, maybe all of you are in Britain, we seem to have fared very well, relatively speaking, compared to countries such as Britain, compared to the United States, compared to Sweden, which didn't lock down stringently, or Belgium, which did lock down fairly stringently, both countries with similar sized populations to Israel. Three key factors probably in Israel having done as relatively well as it did. First of all, we internalized fairly early, the leadership internalized fairly early what was going on. A lot of credit attaches to Netanyahu himself, I would say. He was among the first, we were among the first countries, maybe the first to advise Israelis against non-essential travel. And soon after we didn't do it perfectly, but to essentially close the airport from fairly early on, 2 weeks quarantine for Israelis who are coming back, measures that are only now starting to go into force in Britain, for example, that 14-day quarantine thing. It wasn't hermetic. There have been screw-ups all the way along, but broadly speaking, that was the policy. So that sort of sealing the outer envelope was done pretty rapidly. The second part, I think, was the lockdown regulations. When they were introduced, they were fairly widely and well respected. Again, not perfect. And I think what was striking about this was Netanyahu a few weeks ago, well into the crisis, referred to the fact that when he was studying at MIT in the States in the 70s, an early lecture in a statistics course, his first lecture in this course, he said, the lecturer spoke about the exponential spread of viruses, how rapidly they can spread. And he said, Netanyahu, this lecture has kind of etched in his mind. And when he heard there was a pandemic afoot, he sort of recalled that lecture and realized how quickly contagion can spread. Netanyahu, from the beginning, spoke about this pandemic in, really apocalyptic terms. He compared it to the Spanish flu. He intimated, I would say, that tens of millions of people around the world could lose their lives. He specified that tens of thousands of Israeli lives were at stake. And he basically said, stay at home under the guidelines that were issued at the time. And most importantly, stay away from the people who we are learning are at highest risks, especially the elderly people. If you love your parents and your grandparents and they're all in those high risk age groups or they have pre-existing medical conditions, love is staying away from them. Now, I think Israelis, I'm not sure that we all bought the sort of the terribly bleak scenarios that Netanyahu was invoking as at least being possible. But I think people were sufficiently sobered, shall we say, to take the regulations seriously. So when we were told, there were periods around festivals, for example, there were a few times when there was a full closure, stay home for not many hours, but there were weeks where people were not supposed to go out unless for essential purposes, certainly not to go far from their homes. Again, nothing, I wouldn't say we were perfect, but we were fairly disciplined. And those many of you on this call who know Israel and know Israelis know that we're not a particularly well-disciplined people. We're individualistic, shall we say, where we raise an eyebrow about impositions by authority. And yet I think people took it very seriously. And it wasn't sort of dictatorial commands of a regime. It was a prime minister clearly navigating between two parameters. In other words, we would watch on television, and still do, by the way, leaders in the health hierarchies and in the financial hierarchies often arguing with each other. So, and this is obviously is a feature of this process wherever it's played out around the world, that the health authorities lean towards taking, on the whole, lean towards taking more stringent measures, and the financial authorities, concerned about consequent economic meltdown, argue for more lenient measures. And we saw all of this playing out in Israel, and we saw Netanyahu essentially charting a middle course, and people accepted it, respected it. So again, hasn't been perfect. I'll talk a little bit about the economic meltdown in a second, but we were pretty serious about it. So that was element two. Element one, closing the country off. Element two, telling people to stay home when it was necessary and them listening. And element three, the controversial and constantly changing, by the way, process of digitally tracking Israeli exposure to contagion. Again, not unique to Israel, although some of the specific procedures, I'm sure, were tailored for Israel. We had the Shin Bet security service that was overseeing this process, and isn't anymore as of tomorrow or as of today. But we had this process, and now others will be managing the data, whereby, you know, it takes a few days for contagion or infection to be, well, certainly has taken a few days. The tests, I'm sure, are improving, for people to test positive if they're carrying COVID-19. And the system that's been used, again, not only in Israel, but that's been used here, is, you know, you would get an SMS to your mobile phone. If it turned out that 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 days ago, you unknowingly were in close proximity for a relatively protracted time to someone who, again, unknowingly turned out to be carrying the virus, and people were ordered into quarantine. Again, that helped restrict the contagion. So I think those three factors were a big reason in our doing relatively well. Just to give you a sense of relatively well, I don't know how many of you obsessively look at sites like the Johns Hopkins sites or Worldometer, but if you look at them, you can make the comparisons. And just in the context of Anglo Jewry, for example, where the community, we can discuss how strong the community is numerically, but let's say 300,000 Jews in Britain, and last time I looked, certainly well over 400, maybe considerably more than that, fatalities from COVID-19. Israel is a country of over 9 million people, and we are at 299 fatalities. So now there's more deaths in the Anglo-Jewish community than in all of Israel. All of these deaths are terrible. I'm just trying to give you some sense of relative impact. If you look at Britain as a whole, right, 65 million people, so maybe 7 times the population of Israel, and over 100 times our toll. Look at the United States, 30 times our population, 300 times our toll. I mean, these are rough numbers, but you get the idea. There's so much. What's striking to me, and I'm not any kind of scientific or medical expert, but what we've done at the Times of Israel, obviously, as other journalistic enterprises have done, is we've spoken to experts. So we've spoken to epidemiologists, and we've spoken to some of the researchers who are trying to find treatments for the virus and so on. The overwhelming sense you get, and again, this is the case around the world, is that this is supposedly a fairly simple virus. It doesn't mutate, we have been told. It's not even clear that there are different strains of the virus. And yet there is so much that we don't understand about it. And, please God, a vaccine is coming, but it's not a vaccine that was straightforward. There's this contradiction that this seems to be, or we're being told, this is a fairly simple virus. On the other hand, stopping it, not straightforward. And the way it strikes, leaves so many questions open. Yesterday, you may have read, including on the Times of Israel, there was a first Israeli flight to Cyprus, the first sort of Cyprus reopening to tourism, because they've done very well, again, relatively speaking. And the first flight to come in, there's only 22 passengers on it, as far as I know, was from Israel. And then they're opening up to other countries. And we're gradually trying to open up to other countries. But we still understand so little. How is it that the Cypruses or Greece or Lebanon or Syria, Gaza, the West Bank, have done even better? than Israel? And how is it that some other countries, obviously relevant for this call, notably including the UK, are having so much harder a struggle? Is there a climate factor? Well, even from what I've said already in the countries I've mentioned, it's not clear that that's a credible factor. I mean, you can start to pick away at those comparisons. How sure can we be that Lebanon is as capable as Israel of actually keeping track of what people are dying from and so on? There's all sorts of factors you can bring in, but there still seems to be a great deal of mystery about what is ostensibly a fairly straightforward kind of threat. Economically, and I think this is, I mean, for me, this was really interesting. Quite early in the crisis, I interviewed somebody called Moshe Halbertal, who is a philosopher. You can look him up. You can look up the piece. And I was asking him about, interpretations of what we were going through. People who are claiming there's some kind of divine hand here, or that this is kind of an inevitable punishment for mistakes in the way societies operate and so on. I had a very interesting conversation with him, and he disagreed with lots of things that I was raising, not necessarily as my own views, but he batted away some of the questions. But what I found really interesting about what he said, one of the things I found really interesting was he talked about almost everywhere around the world, the fact that our hard-hearted capitalist societies, in tackling this virus on the whole, put aside those kind of free market principles. Because when you look at it, when you look at the vulnerable groups, the most vulnerable groups include relatively elderly people, about whom you could brutally say that they contribute less to societies than they did in the past and than younger people do. And therefore, if you were allowing a free market to function, you might be tempted to not take the economically devastating lockdown measures to keep them safe. You might be more callous. And almost without exception around the world, that wasn't the case. Almost without exception, Halbertal pointed out, societies did choose to intervene, if you like, in the way free market capitalist societies run and protect the elderly and the vulnerable. And he thought that was a rather admirable and beautiful moment for societies. And I think that's a point very worth making. The consequences of the measures that we and other societies have imposed, of course, has been very, very severe economic meltdown. By the way, all kinds of other consequences as well. People not going to hospitals because of concerns. Lockdown impact in terms of abuse and psychological issues and all kinds of other things. But to focus briefly on the economy and the Israeli context, it has put our economy into, I don't know if meltdown is too strong, I think not. We had less than 4% unemployment in Israel before the virus struck in March, and now unemployment went up above 25%. It's starting to come down again, but there will be hundreds of thousands of Israelis unemployed in the medium term, according to most estimates. It has had a devastating effect, including most especially perhaps on independent small businesses and so on. And while there is a great deal of credit rightly attributed to the government's handling of this crisis from a keep us safe and minimize contagion point of view, much more criticism of the economic handling of this, and especially not that the government has necessarily not been generous, although there's a lot of statistical arguments that you can make on that issue, but that the intended aid and the climate and provisions that were intended to ensure that banks made easy-ish to repay loans available and so on, the sort of financial safety net that the government tried to put into place has not been as effective as it needed to have been. And from the start, while the health authorities have been doing their job, the protests of the economically most affected have continued, they began, they escalated, and they continue. A sense of poor choices made in high levels about how funds were allocated, endless complaints about provisions for grants that were beyond the reach of people. They didn't get the money or they weren't eligible for the money. A lot of criticism of the banks for not making loans available. other funds trying to step in and to help because the banks were not, to use the Israeli expression, getting under the stretcher. It's kind of a military metaphor, and so on. So a lot of criticism of the economic performance still playing out. And now, as I speak to you on June the 10th, we are also concerned in Israel, and we don't know quite how concerned to be about whether, I don't think we thought that we were through the worst, but we maybe wanted to think that we were through the worst, and we're not sure where things are heading now. There's certainly, as Israel has kind of opened up again, and it has opened up, most dramatically, I suppose, with schools gradually going back. But obviously and unsurprisingly, the infection contagion rate has risen. It has not risen to any levels that would compare with the most affected countries, and it hasn't risen to the levels of the height that even Israel endured. But it has risen, and we've had schools closing down. Last time I checked, there was something like 24,000 staff and students from Israeli schools who are in quarantine because one or more staff or students were found to be carrying the virus. And if there's a single positive case, they've been closing down schools as a precautionary measure for a number of days. One of the unique factors, maybe not unique, but one of the certainly characteristic factors of the Israeli education system is there are a lot of kids in our classrooms. We produce some incredible people out of our school system. As the father of 3 kids, I can testify to that, but also I can testify to the not quite sure how these schools work so effectively, given that they're not particularly well funded, given that there are loads of kids in the classroom in many Israeli schools. And when you have loads of kids in a classroom in a society that is gradually opening up while it's tackling a virus, you're going to get a rise in contagion. And that's what we're getting here. Now, obviously, it's crucial to get the schools back open because if kids aren't at school, the parents can't go back to work. And if you want to get the economy moving again, well, you've got to get the parents back to work. So that's what's playing out here now. We are not back at the height of the crisis by any means. And the height of the crisis for us has not been too appalling, relatively speaking, as I think I've stressed. But we are certainly witnessing a slight rise in contagion, and there are concerns about it. Maybe one last thing that I want to say on this, and then I'll move on to the other matters, just to say how striking it is. And again, one of the benefits of these kinds of conversations and communication generally in this day and age is you can get a sense of what's going on a long way away. And it was not clear, certainly not to me, and I don't think to Israel as a whole, that our behavior was in any way particularly admirable. And by the way, I'm not sure it was particularly admirable, but the fact is that one of the ways that are central to stopping this contagion is mutual respect and consideration. If you respect the rules, if you wear a mask when you're out in public, if you stayed home when you were supposed to stay home and so on, if you keep your distance from people, if you don't sneeze in people's faces, etc., this mutual consideration, if you respect that, you're gonna be saving lives, right? And we've done that on the whole. And I'm not saying that everybody else anywhere in the world hasn't done that, but I've had conversations with people abroad, and it's become clear that it's not the norm everywhere for the degree of mutual consideration that we have shown for each other in Israel. And I think it's worth pointing out because this is divided Israel, right? Where we argue about everything. We're divided. Jews and Arabs are divided. Left wing and right wing, Orthodox and secular, and so on. I mean, that's overstated and that's a little bit flippant, but you get my point. And yet, in this very passionate society with lots of argument and lots of divisions, we've taken it for granted that we've tried to respect each other and respect the regulations, and that's been a big deal. And maybe the emblematic image of all of that, you guys probably know, and we all know, that the Israeli medical system is proof that, the divides are marginalized by comparison to the imperative to keep people healthy and alive in Israel, by which I mean our whole medical system is a wonderful mix of people from all parts of the Israeli demographic, doctors and nurses and all the other crucial healthcare workers, Arabs, Jews, left-wing, right-wing, Orthodox, secular, ultra-Orthodox, ultra-secular, you name it, they're all part of the system. And like I say, the emblematic image maybe is the Magen David Adom ambulance parked outside a hospital, 2 paramedics, 1 Jewish, 1 Arab, praying, 1 to Mecca and one to Jerusalem and 1 to Mecca, which happen to be in opposite directions. And that's kind of, like I say, a kind of emblematic image. Health workers with their very different orientations, if you like, in terms of their religious identity, working together to save lives. Okay, like I say, all of this playing out at the same time as we have have had a very protracted political crisis here. We had 3 elections, April, September, and March, April 2019, September 2019, and March 2020, in which there was no clear winner in the battle between Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his challenger, the blue and white leader and former Israeli Army Chief of Staff, Benny Gantz. Gantz came close to ousting Netanyahu, but not close enough. In the 3rd election, he was actually endorsed for Prime Minister by 61 of the 120 Knesset members, but those 61 would not have coexisted easily, if at all, in a Gantz-led coalition. And at the end of March, in other words, a little over 2 months ago, 2.5 months ago, Gantz abandoned the core promise of his blue and white party's campaign, which was that they would oust Netanyahu and they would certainly not sit in government with Netanyahu. And he decided, because he said of a combination of the virus threat and concern for the well-being of democracy, if Likud and Netanyahu were left to run the country for further transitional period before possible 4th elections, for those reasons, he was going to switch and actually partner Netanyahu in a coalition. This led to the collapse of the blue and white party into some of its constituent parts. Part of blue and white and the name went with Gantz into the Netanyahu coalition. The other parts of blue and white, now in the Yesh Atid and Telem original factions, went into the opposition. And Yesh Atid's Yair Lapid, who brought Gantz into politics really, and who sort of put the party mechanism at Gantz's disposal. Yair Lapid is now the leader of Israel's opposition and a very, very bitter critic of Gantz for having abandoned their campaign promises. Now we have a government in which Gantz is the alternate prime minister and defense minister, and a coalition deal under which in November 2021, Netanyahu is supposed to hand over power to Gantz. Will that actually happen? Well, it's a long time between now and November 2021. The core purpose of this unity coalition for its first 6 months, although this can be adjusted, is to deal with the pandemic, and most especially now, I would say, or largely now, the economic fallout of the pandemic. One of the elements of the coalition deal that is worth highlighting, however, is that whether Gantz likes it or not, from July the 1st, Netanyahu can advance moves to annex, extend Israeli law, extend Israeli sovereignty, whichever terminology Netanyahu chooses to use. Then there are lots of reasons for differing terminology, but there's no huge difference, practically speaking. Netanyahu, from July the 1st, has the right, under the coalition deal, even if Gantz opposes it, to unilaterally begin annexing those parts of the West Bank, of the biblical Judea and Samaria, that are allocated to Israel under the US administration, the Donald Trump peace to prosperity vision that the president unveiled at the White House at the end of January. Now, Netanyahu, as soon as that program was unveiled, said, okay, I'm going to start annexing within days. And the administration slapped him down. Jared Kushner, who's one of the key authors of the plan, said, no, not so fast. First, we need a fully functioning Israeli government, and we need to map out what's involved here. Our maps included in the plan are conceptual maps. They're not extremely precise, and therefore you can't do this right away. It's going to take a while. So Netanyahu was kind of forced back, but is now again talking about July the 1st, certainly to annex all the settlements. If you hear what he has been saying to settler leaders, 132 settlements, home to maybe 450,000 Israelis. Does he have the votes to do this in Parliament, in the Knesset? Probably yes. Does he have the support in the cabinet to do it? Maybe not if Gantz and co want to oppose him, but he could get it through the Knesset, and that presumably would be sufficient. Does he have, crucially, American administration support? That he needs that, including in the terms of the coalition deal. And that's a very difficult question to answer, because I could tell you, sure, American administration officials have said over and over, and they have, that annexation is up to Israel. It's Israel's decision. As recently as yesterday, one member of the US administration said, of course, it's up to Israel, and the US will recognize whatever decisions Israel makes. By contrast, in a briefing, on the record briefing, by a senior State Department official just 2-3 weeks ago, Israeli reporters were told that annexation is something that needs to be discussed between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Well, the Palestinians aren't discussing annexation. The Palestinians preemptively rejected the Trump plan, and yesterday announced that they had submitted a counter proposal, not to the US, but to the peace quartet, which is the US, the EU, the UN, and Russia, proposing a Palestinian state in the pre-67 territories with the possibility of some land swap arrangements. In other words, their kind of maximalist traditional position set against the proposal that Trump has unveiled and Netanyahu's plan to start unilaterally annexing. So it's very, very complicated. And the American position is very complicated. And since we've got a little bit of time, I'll just elaborate on that briefly about the contradiction in the American position. The plan itself, the Trump plan, makes no provision for unilateral annexation by Israel. It doesn't, in other words, say, here's what we're giving Israel, here's what we're giving the Palestinians, but the Israelis can take their bit right away. Quite the reverse. It talks about this is meant to be the deal of the century. This is meant to be the framework for a negotiated arrangement. Now, the Palestinians are rejecting all dealings with it, but that does not mean in the plan that Israel can go ahead and start annexing. Nonetheless, in the speech that Trump made unveiling the plan, he said that the US would immediately recognize Israeli annexation of the territories provided for in the plan. It was a very strange sentence. And I can't reconcile that for you. I can tell you that there is an argument, and I've written about this, if you want to look up this in more detail, by all means. You know, for some, certainly it would seem Netanyahu and maybe the American ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, the plan is a nice idea. Obviously, the Palestinians are going to reject it. And therefore, unlike in the past, Israel can start to reap the rewards right away. Whereas for Kushner, it would seem, and maybe others in the administration, no, this is a serious plan, an effort to advance progress, to keep the US's, some of its Middle Eastern allies on board, to have them maybe push the Palestinians towards engagement. And certainly, you know, the provision is that, well, Israel is going to get some benefits one way or another, but not the sense that those rewards, those spoils, should be reaped right away. So there seems to be a discrepancy there. It's not clear completely what the American position will be. And then, of course, add in the fact that right now, the administration is grappling with anti-racism protests, and it's grappling with its own dealings with COVID-19 and all of the drastic and dramatic consequences of that. Not clear what the American position will be. Not clear that Trump's evangelical supporters are pushing him hard on this. It doesn't seem to me that it's the resonant issue that Jerusalem was, for example. All kinds of things that are not clear what the timetable and timeline might be. You know, there's been a lot of talk here in the last few days. If Israel doesn't do this by mid-August, which is when the Democratic Party has its convention, then it will be too late, because then the American presidential elections will be in full swing. All kinds of factors playing out here. You might ask yourself, why is Netanyahu so gung-ho to move ahead with unilateral annexation when it risks potential violence on the ground, when it risks certainly destabilizing our peace treaty with Jordan, when even Israel's friends in the European community are firmly opposed to this? The German foreign minister was in Israel today, may have moved on to Amman by now. I think he may still be here. He said, you know, annexation is illegal under international law. He also said, I'm not talking about sanctions or punitive measures. We're in the stage of diplomacy at this point. But clearly, not endorsing annexation by any stretch of the imagination. The American Democratic Party certainly opposed to unilateral annexation. Much of diaspora Jewry, anywhere from opposed to discomforted. I would have thought that the BDS and the Boycott Israel movements are delighted by the prospect of Israeli annexation, and will seek to use it to lobby for punitive action against Israel. I can't imagine the Iranian regime is unhappy at the prospect. And therefore, again, we ask ourselves, what is Netanyahu's thinking here? I would add that lots of the settlers are not, and their leaders are not particularly gung-ho about what is playing out, because they're worried that the Trump plan provides conditionally for Palestinian statehood. And in the conceptual maps, at least, a Palestinian entity would surround at least 15 Israeli settlements, and therefore they would be isolated in a Palestinian territory. So, not all the settlers are on board. Some of them are. All of these things playing out. So why is Netanyahu pushing it? So a colleague of mine at the Times of Israel, Chaviv Retik Gur, wrote an article that we published today talking about why he thinks Netanyahu, or why the analysis is that Netanyahu is moving ahead with this, because of a sense of consensual Israeli support for aspects of the program, because that's one of the factors that I would say. There's the question of whether Netanyahu wants this to be his legacy. I would add in two other cynical points. First of all, that and this really is cynical. I'm not saying I endorse it. As I mentioned at the very beginning, Netanyahu is on trial now. And one of the cynical takes is that this is all headline stuff because it's deflecting attention from the criminal cases against Netanyahu. I've heard people make that argument. Lapid, the opposition leader, has said this is all spin. Somebody who wrote a biography of Netanyahu is adamant, Anshel Pfeffer is his name, a Haaretz journalist, is adamant that Netanyahu is not going to go ahead and do this at all. I think in the context of Netanyahu's trial, I'm paid to be skeptical. I suppose that's one of the things that journalists do. I think that is too cynical. I don't think that the benefit to Netanyahu personally. I'm not sure what the benefit is. I certainly don't think there is any kind of a benefit that would offset the ructions surrounding this issue. And another potential explanation that is again a cynical explanation is that this is some kind of election gambit, that Netanyahu does not really intend to go ahead with it. By the way, it kind of only sort of became elevated to a major issue for Netanyahu in the course of these election campaigns, in the context of him trying to minimize the votes going to the parties to the right of him, which you might sum up under the headline of Yamina, the pro-settlement party and its various factions and offshoots led by Naftali Bennett. Netanyahu wanted people to vote for his Likud, not for Bennett's Yamina in its various incarnations. And the sort of annex the territories thing or part of the territories became a sort of campaign pledge that became increasingly repeated by Netanyahu. So is this all domestic politics? Is this Netanyahu gearing up to say fairly soon, it would have to be, you know what, I'm being prevented by Gantz and others from moving ahead with my pledge for annexation. I want to get broad support. I think this is a fateful and extraordinary moment for Israel. And therefore, I'm going to cancel my coalition deal with Gantz and we'll have fourth elections and you'll see how much public endorsement there is for this move and my other policies. I don't know what to make of that. I tend towards not believing that either. It will take a long time for an election process. And I'm not sure how responsive and positive Israelis would feel about being dragged into a fourth election. On the other hand, Netanyahu is soaring in the polls. Likud is heading for 40 seats, according to the last poll that I saw a few days ago. Gantz's party, even his part of what was his party, is falling. So the domestic political map looks good for Netanyahu at the moment. And he's locked into this rotation deal with Gantz to hand over power in November 2021. So does he want to extricate himself from that with annexation as a gambit? Again, it's not a good enough answer as far as I'm concerned. Maybe there are other elements that all of us are missing. Maybe Netanyahu is going to go through with this, believes that it's essential, thinks he has Trump on his side, believes that the consensus in Israel has moved in this direction, thinks that the international opposition is being overstated. Maybe won't do the entire 30% of the West Bank. That's maybe 3% covering the settlements and the rest being the Jordan Valley. Rather, maybe he'll just annex 1 or 2 or 3 of the major settlement blocks, which are emphatically closest to the Israeli consensus, the Etzion block, south of Jerusalem, Ma'ale Adumim to the east of the city, and Ariel further to the north. Maybe there's all kinds of speculative stuff playing out here. It's very interesting to watch Gantz and our foreign minister, Gabi Ashkenazi from Gantz's party, maneuver. They support the Trump plan as written, as a negotiated process. They're not endorsing, they certainly haven't publicly endorsed unilateral steps. But Gantz had a meeting with some settler leaders yesterday, and he certainly, as far as we can tell, and not in his formal statement that was issued after the meeting, he did not come out strongly against unilateral action. So there's an interesting tactical process playing out here. I don't know how it's going to play out. Those are some of the factors. Last couple of things that I want to say. One more thing about the Netanyahu trial, which is just to stress that it will take a long time to play out. The process can go on for years. The High Court, which was asked to prevent Netanyahu from setting up a new government as a prime minister under indictment, chose not to do so. There's a lacuna in Israeli law. A minister who's on trial would have to step down, not so a prime minister. Will the Supreme Court, will the High Court intervene when Netanyahu becomes alternate prime minister if he hands over? It's not clear. But the trial is a long, long process in which basically Netanyahu is alleging that Israeli law enforcement has become part of a biased political attempt to oust him. Israelis very divided on that issue. But plainly, if you look at the polls, a majority of Israelis are sufficiently confident in Netanyahu as opposed to alternatives, sufficiently supportive of the Netanyahu-led bloc of right-wing and orthodox parties to keep him in power. I mean, that's what's happened. He's our longest-serving prime minister. And Benny Gantz, who mounted the most serious challenge that Netanyahu has faced in the past decade, has moved over towards, to a partnership with Netanyahu. That doesn't mean he's become part of the Netanyahu camp, but he is now a facilitator of Netanyahu's ongoing prime ministership, having been the person who brought those security credentials and most effectively challenged Netanyahu. And the last thing that I want to say is again, to end my sort of opening bit, at least, on a slightly upbeat note, is just to stress again, this tiny little country in an era where the world is battling COVID-19, on the cutting edge of the efforts to find A, a vaccine, and B, a treatment. I don't know if Israel is going to be the country that comes up with the vaccine. I don't know if Israeli researchers are going to be the ones who find the best treatment for the virus. But I am struck by, again, and on the basis of the things that we report, that we're around the cutting edge in both of those areas. This tiny little country in this extremely difficult geostrategic location, not only surviving and thriving, but thriving even in this sort of challenge that the whole world is taking on now to try to find a hermetic, or at least semi-hermetic way of tackling COVID-19. And with that, I will be quiet, and you take this wherever you wish.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. This was fascinating. The first question we'll start with, what do you think, what do you feel would happen to the Israeli-Jordanian relationship if Netanyahu proceeds with the annexation? I mean, to what extent is Jordan really relying on Israeli security? And how much room does the Jordanian king have to go against Israel in that regard?
Yeah, it's a good question, of course. And I don't know the answer to it. The second part, room for maneuver. On the one hand, you'd say the Hashemite kingdom has proved itself capable of maintaining power. On the other hand, it's a deft balancing act that it plays. They've maintained a peace treaty with Israel for a quarter of a century. It's very important to them. It's very important to us. It's the longest border that Israel has. Economically, very important for Jordan in terms of Israeli technology, Israeli intelligence sharing, security, and so on. Very important to both sides. Much will depend on how exactly this plays out, if it plays out. A unilateral declaration of Israeli sovereignty in 30% of the West Bank overnight would look different than an Israeli declaration of sovereignty, for example, in the 3 settlement blocks, as I mentioned. The degree of drama would escalate or change within the parameters between those 2 extremes. In other words, Netanyahu could choose to annex all the settlements, but not the Jordan Valley early on, etc. According to the readout we got from a meeting that he had with settler leaders at the start of this week, he talked about July the 1st, yes to the settlements, to all the settlements, and maybe the rest of the territory, specifically the Jordan Valley, that would have to wait. So again, a lot of uncertainty about what he's actually going to do. And depending on what he does, the degree to which this would impact Jordan. Jordan has shown itself ready to demonstrate displeasure with Israel. There was an annex to the treaty that enabled a 25-year provision for Israel to continue to farm 2 enclaves at the Jordanian border. The spirit of the accord was that this was an annex for 25 years with provisions for the lease to be extended for another 25 years, while King Abdullah cancelled any further provision, and that territory was formally restored to Jordan. Israeli farmers are not farming those enclaves anymore as of just a few weeks ago. So it's not as though Jordan has not shown a readiness to take action. What they've said is that they would review their relations with Israel. What has been widely suggested is that they would withdraw their ambassador right away. And what is speculated is that it would lead to the collapse of the peace treaty. I have no more wisdom than that. There's no credible take on how this would play out. It may be that the Jordanians themselves have not decided, and they may have made their provisions, but it's not clear to them, I'm sure, what Netanyahu intends to do. And just one last point I should make in that area. When I keep giving you sort of this sense of lack of clarity, certainly as of the last 3-4 days ago, the Israeli army and the Israeli security hierarchies are not clear on what Netanyahu may have in mind. So we may be less than 3 weeks, right, or 3 weeks away from that first possible date for advancing annexation. But the IDF, which has been holding drills and so on about how it would prepare, what's going to happen on the ground, what kind of deployments, what kind of call-ups may be necessary or may not be necessary. The IDF does not know specifically what Netanyahu has in mind, and therefore so much is still very speculative.
Thanks, David. Another question. There was a letter signed just last week, I think, by 40 members of the UK Jewish community, which condemned the annexation, and it was handed to Mark Regev, the Israeli ambassador in the UK. And to what extent do you think this kind of things have effect on Israel's policy? To what extent do you think the opinions of the Jewish community globally, which one can assume are more on the liberal side than the Israeli mainstream opinion, to what extent do you think it affects Netanyahu's considerations?
Look, I don't know, but I think obviously it's in the mix, and not an insignificant part of the mix. I spoke really fast. I apologize for that, but most of you are Brits, so you understand me fine, I'm sure. There's a dozen reasons that come to mind right away about why Netanyahu, that you would think would be part of the mix and would incline towards giving the prime minister pause, right? On the other hand, he does not seem to suggest that he's going to pause. Again, it's very hard to tell because we don't know exactly what he's going to do. This is not a prime minister. This is a prime minister whose tenure has been marked by careful calibration and consideration And therefore, I don't doubt that all of these things are factoring in. And that's why, you know, there's something of a disconnect between this accumulation of factors, in which diaspora Jewry concern is certainly one of them, and what seems to be a determination to move ahead in any case. Very difficult to reconcile. You know, the pile of considerations that would seem to suggest, well, maybe not the best idea, and all the signs of moving forward. And something you said in the question is interesting. You know, you're talking about diaspora Jewry, which presumably is a little more liberal than the Israeli mainstream. I think that's a really important factor to bear in mind. It's very hard to assess how great the difference is between the sort of consensuses. And I'm very wary about doing it, but I don't think you made an illegitimate assessment there. Israeli mainstream society has moved to the right. I don't think lurched, and I don't think irrevocably, but I do think it's moved to the right in the past 2 decades. And that's a factor of where we are. And my job here is to try and give you some sense of what's going on. So in that context, you know, this is a country that elected Yitzhak Rabin in 1992, broadly speaking, with a mandate to try and advance the peace effort, and was still, you know, in the mid 90s, was still, in the late 90s, maybe was still, maybe, yeah, like I say, until 20 years ago, was somewhat open-minded and somewhat confident in the potential to make progress. And then came the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada was a strategic onslaught of suicide bombings, and it has traumatized Israelis ever since, and is underestimated elsewhere. You know, we were essentially, we got up every morning knowing people were trying to kill us, and about once a week they were succeeding, and it was just terrible. And it's extraordinary, you know, we take it for granted that Israel hung in there, but there's no automatic assumption like that could have been made. We decided to not be terrorized into leaving the country. So that trauma is still there. And then we left Gaza unilaterally in 2005, having left Lebanon unilaterally in 2000. In both cases, extraordinarily hostile, Iranian-linked terrorist organizations have filled vacuums. We had a war with Hezbollah in 2006. They are deployed across that border with more than 100,000 rockets and missiles all pointed in our direction. Hamas took over in Gaza, and we live in a world now, and we've had, you know, 3 major flare-ups with Hamas, endless escalations, and we live in a world where the supreme leader of Iran can post in social media about seeking to eliminate Israel, and there's little Israel. And our confidence in international support, our confidence in our narrative being understood is battered. We are traumatized. I'm talking about the Israeli mainstream, traumatized by some of those events that I've mentioned. The Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas, I don't think Abbas is orchestrating terrorism in the way that Arafat did, but is he inciting against Israel and trying to disconnect modern Israel from its Jewish heritage? I would say that he is. Are Israelis concerned that if we relinquish adjacent territory in the West Bank, that really, really bad people will take over, and then this country becomes paralyzed because you actually couldn't move around? Nobody would be using the airport, you know, if Hamas was running the West Bank. These are all factors in that shift. So it's not the Israel of 20 years ago. It's an Israel that has concluded that relinquishing adjacent territory can be extraordinarily dangerous. I don't think it's an Israel that has given up on the notion of one day being able to achieve some kind of accord. It's certainly not an Israel that wants to give up on that. But I think that explains that difference that you highlight in your question.
Yeah. One of the most important institutions in Israel is the military and the security services, but we haven't heard much from them about what do they think the consequences of annexation would be, and to what extent, what is their opinion, and to what extent, obviously, do they affect Netanyahu and his decisions?
It's another really good question, and it's correct. In other words, it's correct, but I'm not sure it's atypical. You know, the army is the operational arm of the Israeli government. It has no public diplomacy role, that's for sure. You can be certain that the heads, not just of the army, but of the Shin Bet, which is domestic security, of course, and the Mossad and the National Security Council, there are forums in which they make their opinions clear. It's not definitively clear how loudly they are speaking and how strongly they are speaking up either for or against annexation from an operational facts on the ground, consequences on the ground point of view. And you know, these are things that often take many, many years to come out. You know, there's been years of argument about why it was that Netanyahu did not take action against the Iranian nuclear program in past years when that crisis was front and center. It certainly hasn't disappeared by any means now, but there's a lot of discussion ongoing about, well, Gabi Ashkenazi, by the way, our foreign minister, was chief of staff for some of that period, you know, is widely believed to have counseled very strongly against an Israeli strike on Iran. Do we definitively know that? We don't definitively know that. So I'm sure there's lots of stuff being said. The sense that we have, make of that what you will, is that the army is not speaking out in any kind of apocalyptic, you cannot do this, this will be a disaster kind of tone, but we don't even know that definitively. And it may be a long time before we do.
Right. Also, with regards, yesterday there was a High Court ruling striking down the 2017 law that legalized homes built on Palestinian land in the West Bank. Does that make any difference to the unilateral annexation plan? I guess we can take that to mean, where do you think Bagatz, the Israeli High Court, how do you think this will play out there? And to what extent would that particular ruling also make a difference?
Yeah, again, these are really good questions. The ruling yesterday, I'm not sure what it means for other potential challenges to the High Court, because the law that was struck down yesterday, if you had to choose a law where there was a pretty large bet that it would be struck down, it was this one. This was not a law that Netanyahu was particularly happy about. Gantz said yesterday this was a law that should not have been passed in the first place. And although there's an outcry against the High Court, there's a clamor on the right against the court, which is deemed to be overly interventionist. But like I say, this was an 8-1 majority. Obviously it wasn't 9-0, but it was 8-1. It was widely anticipated that it would be struck down. You know, this was a retroactive legalization of several thousand homes built on privately owned Palestinian land. You know, the ruling here was a no-brainer is a bit too strong. Widely anticipated. The Attorney General, you know, the government's chief legal advisor, refused to defend the law before the judges. They had to hire other representation. And therefore, what we can learn, I'm not sure what we can learn. You know, and again, I'm wary about predictions. There was a lot of expectation in some circles that the judges would intervene in Netanyahu's coalition building, the Netanyahu-Gantz coalition, strike down elements of the deal that required amending some of Israel's quasi-constitutional basic laws, strike down the notion or bar Netanyahu from setting up a government since he's under indictment, and so on. And not only did the court not intervene, it didn't intervene 15-0, if memory serves. It was the biggest possible bench, the largest number of judges, and the verdicts were fairly caustic and unanimous. I don't even know what that means for the future. Does that mean, you know, they've just decided this week that they will hear petitions about the legality of Gantz's post as alternate prime minister, which is supposed to be Netanyahu's post 18 months from now. You know, did people think that the court would hear those petitions? You didn't know for sure. Do we assume the court will strike down those petitions? I think we kind of do, but are we certain? You know, we don't know. And I'm, like I say, very wary of predictions.
Thank you. Just a question kind of like relating more to Israel and the UK, less about Netanyahu. Tzipi Hotovili has been proposed as a potential candidate for the ambassadorship in the UK. How do you think she will fit in here? And do you think it's a good choice or controversial one?
I don't know her well enough, and I've never interviewed her. I've never spoken to her, and therefore I'm wary to say anything at a personal level. Her political record is clear, and you know, the answer to any of those kinds of questions depends on where you stand on the Israeli political spectrum, right? I think her English is pretty good, but I'm not sure of that, but I think it is. I think we've largely moved away from a habit of some years ago of appointing ambassadors to countries where they didn't speak the language, even sort of central countries. You know, Britain of late has certainly had very articulate ambassadors sent by Israel. You know, this would be, I'm not sure if the current ambassador is formally designated as a political appointee, because Mark Regev was a foreign ministry person who then went to work for the prime minister's office pre-Netanyahu. Hotoveli would be a political appointment, and therefore those parts of the Anglo-Jewish spectrum who are in tune with her part of the political spectrum, I'm sure would find her a more convenient and admirable appointee than people who disagree with the policies that she's on the record as standing for. But on a personal level, I have no particular wisdom to impart, sorry.
One more question. Is Israeli Arab opinion, is it unanimous in opposing annexation, or are there parts in the Arab opinion that is in favor of it or neutral?
Yeah, I wouldn't say unanimous. Widely opposed. In the case of the Knesset representatives of the joint list, there I would be amazed if all and that's a mix of 4 factions. I'm sure all their Knesset members, if you ask them that question, would say adamantly opposed to unilateral annexation. But it's a very complicated part of the demographic here. You know, there's always a difference between Arab local council heads and Knesset members. Local council heads are preoccupied with, you know, the municipal services for their residents. There, I have no idea. In the Druze community, you know, there are Druze. There's a Druze Knesset member from. I think there's one in Likud. I think there's one in Israel Beitenu. I'm sure that they would not come out certainly as strongly, and maybe not at all, against annexation, and maybe some of them are even on the record in that regard. So unanimous is a word that I don't think applies here. Overwhelmingly opposed by their national leadership, I would say for sure.
Just received 2 more questions. I think we'll take 5 more minutes for 2 more questions. The first one is, do you think Netanyahu will be found guilty? And if he does, what do you think? Do you think he'll have to resign? Like, what would be the process if he does? Which is not, it's not unreasonable to assume that he might be found guilty, right?
Okay, so actually I can answer the second part of that. That's good. The first part, no, I can't tell you. I can't tell you. It's my speculative take on it is of no more value than anybody else's. We ran a really good piece by our economic and business reporter Shoshana Solomon. The headline begins "Slowed Down Nation," and it talks about case 4000, which is the most serious case, the case with the bribery charge, and the allegation that essentially Netanyahu did illicit deals with the majority shareholder of Bezek, our major telecommunications firm, who also owned or was the major shareholder in Israel's second biggest news site, Walla. The allegation is that in order to secure favorable coverage from Walla, Netanyahu made decisions as communications minister that benefited Bezek. And among the decisions allegedly made, allegedly illicitly made, was one that preserved Bezek's monopoly in telecommunications, significantly setting back reforms and upgrades in our internet infrastructure. That's a pretty serious allegation, and to my mind, to my non-expert mind, in an impossible to predict context, the most serious central allegations of the most serious case. Whether the Attorney General did not, the way it works in Israel, we're all equal before the law, but a Prime Minister cannot be investigated without the assent of the Attorney General. So the Attorney General signed off on the police investigation and escorted it all the way to an indictment. So the person whose job it is to assess whether there is a reasonable likelihood that the Prime Minister would be convicted is the Attorney General. And the fact is Netanyahu's on trial. At the same time, he is innocent unless or until proven guilty. And there's no, the Attorney General doesn't make that decision. That's the judges initially of Jerusalem District Court. The second part of the question, Netanyahu does not have to resign. As things stand, even if convicted, he would only be required to resign when all appeals have been exhausted. And just to give you a sense of how long that could take, Ehud Olmert resigned before he had been charged while he was still under investigation. 8 years later, he went to jail. That was after he'd been convicted and appealed, and all the appeal processes had been exhausted. So the potential for this to continue for many, many years, even after a conviction, is there.
We've also got a request, if you could send us the articles that you refer to, particularly the one in the beginning about Iran, but we will do that via email, I guess. So that would be it for today. David, thank you so much. This was a fascinating conversation and we've learned a lot. And,
thank you, everybody. And Yaakov, yeah, please tell me the specifics, because I can remember two I referred to, and I don't remember which was the Iran one. So if you could tell me the pieces, I'll be happy to. I'll send them to you, and then you share them with pleasure.
I will do it via email. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a great evening, a great day, and see you next time.
Okay. Be well, everybody.